Okay, well, good afternoon or good evening indeed, for some of you that are joining us. Welcome to the Irish Consulate in Austin's St. Bridget's Day event. My name is Robbie Hull. I am the new Irish Consul General here in Austin. And we are pleased that so many of you are able to join us for this special event, which we are organizing in partnership with the William J. Flynn Center for Irish Studies at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. And we're delighted that Professor Monica McWilliams has agreed to speak to us today. It's particularly special for me that this is my first public event as the new Consul General. Firstly, as somebody who's from Northern Ireland, to be able to have another Northern Irish speaker addressing our event, and in Monica McWilliams, a really remarkable woman who's contributed so much to society, both on the island of Ireland and beyond. There's also another personal connection for me in that legend has it that St. Bridget, who we remember today, and who is one of 3 patron saints of Ireland, that her remains are buried in Downpatrick in County Down, which is the town that my family have lived in for the last 20 years. For those of you who are not aware, the 1st of February is the feast day of St. Bridget. The origins of this celebration are thought to originally be a pagan festival called Imbolc, which honored Bridget as the goddess of poetry, healing, and fire, and marked the beginning of spring. La Feira Brida celebrates the arrival of longer, warmer days and an emergence from the darkness of winter. The day is also seen as a way to celebrate women and the Celtic goddess's heritage as a symbol of feminine energy. This event is part of our 5th International St. Bridget's Day program, and we see this occasion as an excellent opportunity to celebrate the talent and creativity of women and highlight their stories and achievements. Today, we're delighted to host this conversation with Monica McWilliams, together with our partners from the University of St. Thomas. In a moment, I'm going to pass to Laurie Gallagher, who's the director of the William J. Flynn Center for Irish Studies at the University of St. Thomas. Laurie teaches Irish history, politics, law, and culture, and leads students on study abroad trips to Ireland. The Irish government and its consulates in this region have worked closely with Laurie and the Centre since its foundation in 2003. And we've been pleased to host many events together, such as the one we're presenting today. Laurie and Monica will speak for about the next half an hour, and then there'll be an opportunity for you to put your questions directly to Monica. To facilitate this, we're asking that you use the Q&A function here on Zoom, and you can submit questions either that everyone at our event today can see, or you can send them directly to us as the organizers, and we will put them to Monica. Please feel free to submit your questions as we go along, and then we will collate these and ask them of Monica later in the session. Let me now pass to Laurie, who will introduce in more detail our special guest today.
Hello, everyone. And Robbie, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction and for the Consulate in Austin's presentation of this conversation with Monica McWilliams today. Monica, good evening. We're so glad to have you with us to celebrate St. Patrick's Day and the beginning of spring, which sounds lovely as we come out of the cold. We'd also like to appreciate and recognize the Consulate and the Irish government's work as we have been continuing the work of Bill Flynn, after whom our center is named, for his contributions to the peace process in Northern Ireland. And were it not for the work of Monica McWilliams and Bill Flynn and many people, both inside and outside of government there, we wouldn't be able to take our students to Northern Ireland. There wouldn't be peace. And it was only after a conversation with Reverend Harold Good in 2007 in the front windows of the Europa Hotel that he was able to convince me that it was just fine to bring our students to Northern Ireland. So again, Monica, I want to thank you for your work in peace building. I'd like to begin by noting the striking similarity between you, Monica, and St. Bridget. Both women, both stood up and spoke out on behalf of those less fortunate, the poor, the marginalized, those who didn't have a voice. And so I'd like to recognize the award that you received, the John F. Kennedy Profile and Courage Award, for your role as a signatory in the Good Friday Agreement and your negotiations of that agreement. And I'd like to jump right in and ask you to tell us your story, and particularly your life story, and how it is that you came to write your book, Stand Up, Speak Out.
Thanks very much, Laurie, and can I begin by wishing you all a happy St. Bridget's Day. It's a day we celebrate here, and I actually held a St. Bridget's Day conference over 30 years ago and brought folks from north and south of Ireland to my university. And the theme was Women in Religion in Ireland. And every faith was represented. And it was an all-women conference. And we played music and sang songs and talked about the importance of St. Bridget. So 30 years later, it's lovely to be invited to give this talk at the William Flynn Centre. And I want to also pay tribute to all of those of you involved in the centre, because I knew Bill Flynn very well. And he's one of the unsung heroes of our peace process. I love people who stayed under the radar, stayed with us from the start, never give up believing it was possible that we would reach an agreement. And in his memory today, I'm delighted to contribute to your centre. And can I also thank Robbie and his team at the Department of Foreign Affairs in Texas, and give a shout out to my cousin who is there also in Austin and with the same name as myself. So there are many connections with Bill Flynn, with Robbie, who I know, and with my young cousin, Sean. So where did I get the motivation to write this book? It had been in my head for a long time. My father was a great storyteller. He grew up in young Sean's great-grandfather's house. And it was by the river. My grandfather had emigrated to the United States to a sheep farm, made a lot of money in the late 1800s, and remarkably returned and bought a farm. But like too many Irish, he drank too much. And the Punny and Trap knew its own way home. And we nearly lost that farm, but we succeeded. My father's family in particular were tough, resilient people, and they managed to hold on to it. So listening in that house to my father's stories, because we'd all gather there around the fire in the winter, on a night like tonight, on a day like today, and he was a great storyteller. And I often wondered, would any of us inherit that gift? And I didn't know if I was capable of writing a book that dealt with very tough, hard issues, but to tell it through stories. And I was an academic. I'd been trained to write objectively, not to put myself in the story, to put down the facts. But needless to say, the editors told me that I needed to speak from the heart. But I never did let the facts go astray either. But I gathered all the material from the peace agreement in which I'd been involved, the women's movement in which I'd been involved, the anti-apartheid movement, the campaign for nuclear disarmament. I kept diaries every year of my life. And I had journals, but I had to put them all to one side and write the book from memory as I could tell it and recount it. And so I sat down during lockdown when we were asked to stay quiet and stay still and reflect. And I wrote it very rapidly in that time. Well, it lasted a year. But that was the time when I had to stop working internationally, because I was a chair of Interpeace, an international NGO based in Geneva that works in many conflict regions in which I had visited. The year before, I'd come back from Rwanda, where the 25th anniversary of the genocide was taking place. I had visited Colombia many times as it was coming to its peace agreement. And the international travel had to stop. And of course, it was the excuse I always used for not writing, that I was too busy. And then I didn't have that excuse anymore. And the title of the book comes from my experience as a politician and elected representative in a forum called the Forum for Dialogue and Understanding. And on my first day, I renamed it the Forum for Monologue and Misunderstanding because it was toxic. And I was told to shut up and sit down. And it was quite humiliating, actually, because here I was, already a public figure, had published in the field of violence against women, was teaching large classes of students, and the cameras were on me as I was being told to shut up and sit down. So as part of the good support that I'd built around me in the Women's Coalition as an elected party to the peace talks, we did the opposite and decided to stand up and speak out. And hence the need to rewrite the stories of those women back into history. Because most of the stories that have been told about the peace agreement have been written predominantly from male academic point of view or from historians' point of view, and women haven't featured very much. And I think that's been recovered now in the centenary and the suffragist movement, but also the partition of Ireland, which was voted on 100 years ago, a couple of weeks ago in Dublin. And the role that women played and the role of conflict in women's lives was something I wanted to tell. And I wanted to bring the local to the global and make the links between what I was doing in Northern Ireland and what I learned from being part of that process and the mistakes we made to other places that I was working in voluntarily as a facilitator, as a mediator, and as a negotiator. The book was twice as long, Laurie. So 300 pages hit the cutting floor, either because it needed to go or because the lawyers cut it out. And the journalists tell me they want to read the uncut pieces, the cut pieces, because they think that those stories would be really important. But I have to wait until people pass on and aren't able to sue me and bring me to court. So everything that's in the book is on the record. And everything that's in the book was written down by me as I recounted it. So it'd be very hard for those individuals to contest, even if they don't like what I had to say. But the book has been well received. I haven't said anything that wasn't untrue or unfair. And that's been the biggest relief of all to me, because as an author, you're putting yourself out there. Your reputation's on the line. And as someone who had been teaching students about the peace agreement, it was very important that I told the stories in a way that they could understand what in fact was in that peace agreement. And because there are so many myths now as a result of Brexit, and there's so many lies and rumors rattling around the place, which I'm now dealing with because I work with the paramilitary organizations to try and disband them, that I needed to put all of that down and show the role that people played when they stood up on Good Friday and put their hands up, as I did, to say, yes, I am in favor of this agreement. And we made that. We had to make it work. As I said on the 20th anniversary, it was difficult to make it. We have to ensure we don't break it. And that was also why I wrote the book.
Let's go back to your early days and talk about what formed your opinion today and your drive to become involved. Let's go back to when you were 14, 15 at the beginning of the Troubles and explain what it's like, or it was like for you and your family to grow up during the Troubles.
It goes back even further than when I was 14. It goes back from my first memories. I had a very happy childhood and grew up on a cattle dealer's farm and went to the marts with my father, saw him making deals and sticking to those deals and selling cattle. I learned a lot from watching him and my mother, who was a quiet listener, but also knew how to keep the peace in a large family. I have 86 first cousins. And just watching how all of us got along. But we were segregated in the village of Kilrea, small town that St. Patrick was known to have visited, translated as the Church on the Hill, Kilrea. And there were 5 churches. The Catholic Church itself, because it was built during penal time, and after that, had to be built outside the town. So we had 3 miles to walk if we wanted to get to the chapel or the church. And that still is the church that stands today. So we were very aware that there were many Protestant churches, but we didn't meet the Protestants. The Orange Hall, which is the hall built by the Orange Order, was right next to my house, and I watched them, young men and women, dancing on a Saturday night, but we weren't allowed to go there. And they were not allowed to come to us across the road in the parish hall. So we lived amongst each other and we didn't know each other. And the segregation was worse. It was in schools. We went to separate schools. We went in the same bus, but we didn't even mix on the bus. We sat at the back, they sat at the front, boys and girls. And we just took that for granted. The first time I really got to know people from a different faith community than my own was the day I walked into the university. And that's true, I was 18 years of age. So it's quite a lot of memory to hold of segregation. It wasn't just boys and girls being separated, it was Catholics and Protestants. It's a little wonder that we didn't know each other, our culture, or customs. But the troubles hit my door when we were 15 and bombs started to go off a little later. But the first civil rights marches I went on was when I was 17. But I was very familiar with the fact that there was a lack of fairness in voting, gerrymandering, and there was a lack of fairness in housing. We had a slum in our town of Kilrea called Kabul, named after the capital city of Afghanistan. And if you'd asked anybody where Kabul was, they'd have said at the bottom of Coleraine Street. They wouldn't have known it was Afghanistan. And the conditions were horrendous, horrific, overcrowded houses. I remember one family living in a hovel, and the next village had houses that were known as Tin Town because of the corrugated zinc roof. And they didn't like that name being given to their area, but they were trying to live dignified lives in very poor conditions. So I got a social conscience very early on, and my father and mother were very socially minded, and they would quote from the prophet Micah, "Walk humbly, love tenderly, do justice." And the do justice piece was very much talked about in our house. And so I went on those marches with my family. It was the done thing, it was the natural thing, and never did we think 50 years ago on this Sunday that we would have a bloody Sunday. The previous Saturday I'd been on McGilligan Strand singing the anti-internment march and We Shall Overcome, and waving to our local neighbours who were interned in the camp without trial, innocent people, and not all young. Many of them were in their 50s and 60s who had been around and maybe had been playing Gaelic football or speaking Irish, or they weren't involved in anything. And suddenly they found themselves interned in this camp. So we were there to protest against this unjust law. And we faced the army at the bottom of the beach. And all we had was sand under our feet. So no one was going to be throwing stones or throwing anything. And there is an amusing part to it, which was that someone was announcing that the Irish government owned the land once the tide was out. At that time, Articles 2 and 3, of course, recognised the land and the tide and the seas. And we believed it and thought, well, of course the British Army can't do anything to us if we walk in the tide line. Well, I don't know if anybody had ever told the British Army about that particular treaty. But they opened up with CS gas and rubber bullets, and people fell down all around me. And it was a miracle nobody was blinded, because if you hit someone with these large rubber bullets, you would, and people did later become blinded as a result. And we were 15 years of age, and 16 and 17. We were schoolgirls and schoolboys. And so our teachers on the following Monday asked us, did they not realise who they were firing these bullets at. And the wind was blowing the wrong direction, and the gas blew back in the soldiers' faces. They weren't wearing gas masks, and they went crazy. And it was the parachute regiment. And it was the same parachute regiment the following Sunday that opened real bullets and brought down 13 people. And the 14th died a few weeks later as a result of his injuries. And that was 50 years ago, a couple of days, 2 days ago.
Yes.
So those memories never fade, Laurie. But I had hoped that we would continue on a peaceful protest, and that those demands for the right to vote, and that time I carried a placard, one man, one vote, when it should have said one person, one vote. So the consciousness of being a woman or women's rights or feminism came much later. So I cut my political teeth in civil rights. It was much later I went on into women's rights and human rights. But those were the life-changing days at such an early age. So when I'm working with young people now, I remind all of people of my generation that it's very important that we work with 15 and 16 and 17-year-olds on a trajectory that leads you to a different outcome than a military one.
Can you talk about how you go about doing that mentoring of younger people, and how you, whether they're home with you?
Yeah.
Young
some of that mentoring I do
community?
through an organization called Politics and Action in Schools, which is a fairly recent project here in Northern Ireland because our schools are segregated. So what we did was we started to match a Protestant school with a Catholic school in the 15 and 16-year-old category. And actually, the pandemic helped that because they started to meet over Zoom when they physically couldn't meet in very few neutral areas where some of these schools are located. And that project has taken off remarkably. And it's mostly in low-income areas that we initially targeted the schools, and they're debating everything, and there's nothing off the table. And that's really important, that they're getting the opportunity I never got when I was 15. And also, you know, to make sure that they do not get caught up in the toxicity of the current politics of division around Brexit, around the potential of a referendum on the border of Ireland, which is coming down the line. That we do that work now, we put that work in, because that's the generation who are going to determine the outcome of that vote. And that's really important. And I think when we said UN Security Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, which I have to say we're very proud about, because the Women's Coalition was one of the good practice examples that those negotiating at the UN for that security resolution used to show the need for women to be involved in peace building. And that then is now translated into youth peace and security, because the question's asked who is not at the table. And in those days, it was for us, women were not at the table, and we ensured that we got a space by going out and getting elected. And then 30 years later, quite recently, they have now started to talk about youth peace and security. And that's where I put a lot of my effort and energy now, is into that. And my work with the paramilitaries now. I'm on the Independent Reporting Commission to end paramilitarism. Sad to say that we still have them. Armed groups, predominantly on the loyalist side, who did not go away in the way that we had expected after the peace agreement, where prisoners were be reintegrated, combatants would stand down their weapons, which they did. Both of those things happened. But we didn't really go much further than that, and we should have. And we didn't deal with the legacy of the past in terms of truth-telling and justice. And those are the issues that I'm currently working in. And I say that in the last chapter, that it's a lesson, perhaps, a mistake we made, and a lesson for other countries coming out of conflict, that to do these things, to keep the peace process moving, you must enforce what you have agreed. Otherwise, it just becomes aspirations. And some people become very disillusioned, and they go back to their armed groups because it's all they know, or because they profiteer, which was the case I've seen in other conflicts. So we have to show those young people that is not the way of their future, that they should not be aspiring to become recruits to armed groups, or they should not be aspiring to be antisocial in their behaviour in their own communities. It's the unfinished business. But, you know, I think it's John Paul Lederach who writes about conflict resolution. It takes you as many years to come out of conflict as the years you were in it. And so we were in it for 30 years. And it's almost 30 years since the ceasefires, which it will be the year after next in 2024. And I'm working as hard today as I did back then. So patience and persistence in large quantities is my message to others who are involved in this work. But you do see the outcomes, and I'd love to see them. And I do believe that we will never go back in Ireland, not back to what happened in 1916, not back to the terrible civil war in the Republic, nor back to our own civil war in Northern Ireland. We have learned the lessons of how to resolve conflict. And it's still an unsettled place, but we have the lessons there to keep building on what has worked. And that was my message today in all my meetings today with the Secretary of State, Brandon Lewis, and with the Irish government officials. We're now trying to design a process of group transition for those armed groups that are still around.
And I think that it's very important that our audience realizes the long hours you spent of communicating, of dialogue with people. And your point has been all along that you can't just talk to those with whom you agree. You have to talk to everyone, and somehow you have to find a common ground. Can you elaborate on that point?
Yes, indeed. And we worked very closely with those that didn't agree with each other. I worked closely with Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness on one side, with Ian Paisley, with David Trimble. We were the women who had come from the interfaces and had worked across the interfaces. These are the peace walls and the divides that existed. And we had spent 20 years doing that work. And so we were absolutely determined that it would succeed. And the way to do it was to mediate, facilitate, and keep a dialogue going. People thought we were talking to the wrong people. Some people said, you're talking to murderers. And we were outed as, you know, either naive, foolish, or traitors. But we kept doing it, and we did it under the radar, and we opened up back channels. We went into the prisons to talk when invited to do so by the parties affiliated to the loyalist armed groups. And we kept the back channel open to Sinn Féin the entire first year of the talks, when they were not permitted to come to the table because the ceasefire of 1994 had broken down in 96, and it wasn't reinstated until the following year after the talks had started. And we decided we would spend that entire year, both in the room and outside of the room, advocating for their inclusion, because we believed that our three principles of inclusion, human rights, and equality would be in the end what would take us forward. And it paid off, but it wasn't without its pain, because as a result, we got a lot of threats, but we also got a lot of insults that were public. We were told that the only women that should be at this table are the women who are going to polish it. To stand by our men. So we sang Dolly Parton's famous "Stand by Your Man." That we were the Greek chorus of women. In other words, all we were there to do was paraphrase what everybody else was saying, when in fact we were attempting to bring new ideas into the process. We were countering the media's hyping of the process, because in Northern Ireland the newspapers are owned by one side or the other predominantly, and they were carrying their own narratives, and we were trying to counter that with a different narrative. And so all of those roles are what women are accustomed to doing in local communities, but we were doing it at a much higher level which we'd never expected to be in, which was actually at the formal peace negotiations. And eventually, after a year, it started to pay off. We were, Senator Mitchell, who chaired the talks, the US Senator, spoke publicly about the importance of having the Women's Coalition at the table. He actually called us the Ladies' Coalition, but I think that was his generation. And I had to keep reminding him that our official title was the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. And the occasion he'd say, now I want to hear from the women. In fact, there were other women in the room, but they were mostly secretariat staff. So all of that gives you an idea of the visuals and the conversations that were taking place, which were very male dominated, I have to say.
Well, I think that you made waves, you and the other women in the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, and not only by forming your own party, which I thought was a remarkable thing to do in a very short amount of time, but at the same time, you had been so active in what you've described as lowercase p politics at the local level, with cooperatives through the example of your father and other people, as you saw the need for women centers and your involvement in the trade union movement. There was no question that you knew that you had to put action to your words, whereas perhaps some in a higher level, say, once you got into the negotiations of the Good Friday Agreement and then became an elected member of the Legislative Assembly after the Good Friday Agreement, you saw that people were not necessarily reaching across the aisles, as we say in this country, but wanted you to pick a side, and you'd run into that before, and that was one of the things that frustrated you. Describe for the audience what it was like when you were signing the book and they ask you to identify for purposes of the assembly voting.
Yes, there had been legislation passed, and for good reason, which was to do with fair employment, and it was building on fair employment actually coming from Canada. And it was to designate people either as Catholics or Protestants, Unionists or Nationalists. And for employment, they wanted to find out if employers were fairly employing Catholics and fairly employing Protestants in areas where they said, oh, we only have Protestants here because they're the only people applying for the jobs, which was nonsense, and vice versa in some areas. But it was predominantly the discrimination against Catholics getting jobs that they started to introduce this statute that you had to fill in on the day that you were applying for a job on the form, which was anonymous, and would be torn off and kept for information purposes, whether you were a Catholic or a Protestant. And people disagreed with that and said, that's quite shocking that you're having to state that. But I understood it as being important. If you don't have information, there's nothing you can do to change the situation. Information, education, agitation. And it actually did lead to great changes in fair employment. And not just at the point of recruitment, but also at the point of promotion, because you hear about the glass ceiling. And now, of course, you know that this is happening in relation to Black Lives Matter. And you know it's happening in terms of, gender discrimination. But back then in Northern Ireland, the only focus was on religious discrimination. And eventually that's how we began, was to get that piece of legislation on fair employment extended to sex discrimination. British government said there isn't a problem with discrimination against women in Northern Ireland, it's only against Catholics, and we're no intentions of extending the British legislation across. Well, we succeeded. And so I, interestingly enough, most people think I didn't support designations. I do and did, because you needed to understand what you were dealing with. So when it came to us being designated as elected representatives to that first assembly, we had to state whether we were nationalists, unionists, or others. And the piece that I disagreed with and stood up on the very first day of the assembly and said we should not be put into the category of other. We are nationalists, unionists, and others. It's not that there's a binary division, you're either nationalist or unionist. And then there's this miscellaneous category that normally women are filled in or drop into, called the other. And so I made the point that we wanted to be designated as nationalist, unionists, and others, and have our votes counted. The most important thing you need to know is if you were in the box of other, your votes weren't counted for important votes like electing the speaker or the budget. They're really important issues. And the whole thing stopped on the very first day. Can you imagine stopping a historical moment when, for the first time ever, Sinn Féin were sitting in the same room as Paisley's party? It was historical, and here were we, a small group of women, holding up the proceedings because the agreement allowed us to be British, Irish, or both. And I was making the point that we should be able to designate as nationalist, unionists, and others. So the speaker wasn't too happy. He consulted the lawyers, told us that we could not sign in that way, and that we had to then sign in, and I agreed then that we would sign in as inclusive others. And that's what we did. And interestingly, Laurie, they're now having to look at that designation because the category of others is now rising in Northern Ireland. And people are now designating in the census as Northern Irish. There are kids going to integrated schools who see themselves as not in that binary of British or Irish, but both. And certainly the elected representatives from the Alliance Party and the Centre Party, the Green Party, many of those parties who have cross-community candidates don't like to be called others. And they do want their votes counted. And it's possible that they could one day become the largest grouping in Northern Ireland. So all those years ago, we kind of set down a few markers that they're still trying to resolve. But it wasn't a very comfortable place to be in that very first day. When Martin McGuinness was looking across at the DUP and saying it was the first time he'd ever met and seen them. And that he made this very funny joke that he didn't recognize one of them, Sammy Wilson, with his clothes on. And it was a joke, a jibe at the fact that this very conservative DUP candidate had been photographed running naked through a field in his holidays with his girlfriend. And some newspaper had managed to get hold of it. He actually sued the newspaper. And it brought a laugh, because to hear Martin McGuinness saying, "I don't recognize you with your clothes on," kind of broke the tension. But what they didn't hear was Sammy Wilson saying straight back, "And I don't recognize you without your balaclava." So you can imagine the hostilities that existed in that room the first day of our new, first time ever, Legislative Assembly that had every party included who was party to the problem. And now we were all going to be party to the solution. But we got over that. And in many ways, you might well ask, well, did you really? Because we're still facing enormous issues at the minute over Brexit and over the sea border and over the customs issues. But I believe we'll get through them. We've got through worse things in the past. And we just have to keep our eye on where we're going to be in 5 years, 10 years, and keep the thing moving.
Well, thank you, Monica. I think that is a very good conclusion to my portion of our discussion. And I think that you have dropped some breadcrumbs there that I believe have been already presented in the Q&A section. I want to thank you for your time, and I may end up having the opportunity to say a few more words before this is over, but I really do appreciate you telling us your life story. There's so many points that we didn't have a chance to go over, but it's so important for our students, for our audience, to hear your story, your true story about your experience. And then it gives us all a moment to think about what can we do in our own lives here to make a difference, to help other people, in service as you have, by showing how to respect one another, how to get to know one another so that we trust one another. And even if we don't share the same opinion, it's okay to be different, to be diverse, to recognize diversity, but then to row in the same direction, to have that boat moving forward, because that's what we need to do. We need to take care of one another. So thank you for your time, for your example, for your dedication to so many people. And I'll turn it over to Neve and our friends on the Q&A section.
Thanks, Laurie, and thanks, Monica. We have lots of very interesting questions in, so I'll try and get through as many as we can. First up, we have some interest in hearing more about the formation of the Women's Coalition. If you could talk a little bit about that, Monica, and where the Women's Coalition is today.
Thanks very much for that. Women's Coalition didn't come out of nowhere, despite the fact that some of the leaders of the other parties thought we'd fallen out of the sky. We had been around in the women's movement, women's groups, very active women in Northern Ireland. Anyone who's visited Northern Ireland will see how active the women are in small p politics. So when the peace talks were declared in 1996, we sat down, my friend and I, in a cafe and said, wonder will there be any women at the table? And we wrote to the other parties, and I tell this story in the book. And very few of them had the courtesy of even replying to the letter. It wasn't seen as an important issue. And it was really to give them an opportunity to gender-proof their own delegates. And when that didn't happen, we thought maybe we should do this ourselves, a bit like a vanguard movement, form a coalition, put it up to them, because we knew there were going to be 10 parties at the table and it wouldn't be a huge vote. We needed maybe 10,000 votes, and we dreamed it up 6 weeks before the election. We had no money, no office, no phones, nothing, but we had energy, enthusiasm and determination. And lo and behold, we got elected. I often tell people it helps when you have 86 first cousins who have all got relatives and get the word out. But it was really the networks, the pre-existing networks of the women's movement. We put public advertisements in the paper, called people to our meetings. We had a risk in that we could have been seen as having blood in our hands, because we were now entering a political arena, whereas all the work we'd been doing before that was keeping the peace at the community grassroots level, which is what women are famous for, and patted on the back for doing it in a very patronizing way, and then told to move over once the big peace talks start. And we said, no, we're not doing that. But we were worried about being seen as having blood on our hands. And on the other hand, in that public meeting, and I still remember it, I said, you know, we write about the importance of women, and I did as a university lecturer and professor, and I said, we're doing scholarly articles and we're out there talking about it. Why don't we put deeds, not words, in place and do it ourselves? And a little voice at the back of the room shouts, and it's time to wave goodbye to dinosaurs. And that became our election slogan. But you know, you can imagine in 6 weeks, you got to get a manifesto, you got to get policies, you got to get finance, you got to get choose your colours, which we did, which was the suffragist colours. And it was like a snowball, it just rolled. And I nearly died 6 weeks later to discover that I was going to be one of the delegates to the peace talks. Just literally became an accidental activist who fell in as an accidental politician. And I was now at this kind of high level negotiating table, of which I had no previous experience, whereas most of the parties at the table had been in 12 rounds of previous negotiations. But I sat down that first day and looked around the room, and we were the only woman at the table. Myself and my colleague, I was known to be coming from a Catholic nationalist background, and she was known to be coming from a Protestant unionist loyalist background. And that's the way the coalition worked. We worked in twos, one from each side. When we did meetings with Sinn Féin, we would go in twos, and people from different perspectives, bringing those perspectives into our discussions inside the coalition, working out a solution, making a proposal, and then bringing that to the table, much in the way that the final peace agreement was built. But the thing I want to build on there is what Laurie said at the end, is you don't do this alone. You'll burn yourself out. And the greatest privilege of my life was to work with an incredible bunch of supportive women. And on St. Bridget's Day, I need to pay tribute to those whose names will never be known. Mine is, either because I wrote the book or I was known as that blonde one from the coalition. And, you know, I stood for election then afterwards and got elected here in South Belfast. But there's a quote I use in chapter 10. The subtitle of the title of that chapter is The Last Week of the Talks. And I described the tension that was going on and whether we would make it to Good Friday or whether we wouldn't, with a peace agreement in our hands. And it's from an American essayist called Rebecca Solnit. And it says, you do what you can. What you've done may do more than you can imagine for generations to come. And when we set out to form the Women's Coalition, we had never imagined that what we would be building would be there for generations to come. So it was very much an aspiration. And today I live with the reality of that, continuing to make it work.
Thanks, Monica. And maybe following on from that, we also have a question on kind of the importance of including women in peace building more generally. If you could talk about how your experience in Northern Ireland helped you in your later experience internationally in different conflict contexts.
It's a very good question, Eve, and it helped me enormously. I work predominantly with women in other conflicts. I mean, I have worked with men too in Palestinian-Israeli situation in Africa also, but I work predominantly today with Syrian women in southern Turkey and in Geneva, the women who are at the peace talks in Geneva. And that's a long process. And I remember telling those women that when I started out, I didn't think our conflict would last 30 years. And I remember them gasping in the room, thinking after a year that theirs would be over. And look at that now, it's more than 10 years, probably even more than that, dozen years. And those women have never given up. They are the ones building the transitional justice. They're working with displaced women. They're working with the women detained in prison unfairly. They're raising women's rights with human rights issues. Women cannot inherit or pass on legitimacy to their children, even when their husbands are dead. If they have not, men haven't been from Syria. All of the things that we used to have in Ireland, actually. And Irish women had to fight for the rights, those rights, even in a peaceful situation. But it's much worse when you're in a conflict situation and you're stateless, or you don't have a passport, or you can't pass on to your children those rights. So those are the connections we make, Niamh, and we say they're constitutional issues. And if there's a new constitution to be drafted for your country, then women deserve the right to be in that constitution and to have their rights recognised. We are half of society. And if everyone's talking about moving from conflict to peace, well, a sustainable peace is also involving women and their voices and their rights. And it won't be sustainable if you leave them out and exclude them. And those are the lessons we learned. And they're tough issues. And they're not always seen as important issues. They're seen as the big soft issues, education, health. And yet along comes a pandemic and teaches us how important healthcare is. And yet when we raised those issues at the peace talks, they were going, what has that got to do with the war? Or what has integrated education got to do with children's future? But those are the issues. Economic and social issues are often what creates the instability, that creates the conflict, that creates a war. And women understand that because they're having to put bread on the table. They're having to think about livelihoods. And the other thing too that we want to think about is how do we create, you know, a world where we build human relationships? Because at the end of the day, it's our relationships, how we speak to each other in respectful ways, and not use abuse. We know about those things because we have been on the receiving end of them. And those are the kinds of issues that you bring to a peace table that can be missing. And if they're missing, you won't have a comprehensive agreement. It's a very long answer to a very short question. But as they say in Ireland, you know, to me, it's very difficult to say hello in 5 minutes. But these are complicated issues. So I hope the audience is not feeling frustrated at the length of my answers. And I beg your pardon if I'm giving very long answers.
That's great. Thanks. We also have a question in about your experiences in the US and how that influenced your activism in Northern Ireland, and maybe as well how you think the US can continue to support peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland.
I had the opportunity of winning a scholarship to the University of Michigan. I was an urban planner and I got an exchange scholarship, but no one was coming in the other direction, unlike today, because Northern Ireland was so unstable that American parents and professors were reluctant to send their students to Queen's and Belfast. So I went to the University of Ann Arbor, and my project as an urban planner and architect in that school was in inner city Detroit. And that was an eye-opener. And I tell in the book how my mother nearly died when she heard I was going to Detroit. And she said, "You're going to that terrible city where all the violence is taking place?" And I said to her, "Look, Mommy, our town has just been bombed by a 750 bomb. The roof's been blown off our house. The whole streets are damaged, and you're worried about me going to Detroit?" But it was a life-changing experience because I had this wonderful professor, Jim Chaffers, African-American, who allowed me as a young Belfast woman to join his all-Black class of students because he saw me in that way and brought me with him into Detroit. And Detroit was as famous for its racism in those days in the 70s as Belfast was for its sectarianism. And my thesis was on a comparison of how you deal with those issues and redevelop your city in a way that doesn't segregate people more. So it was very timely to be writing about that in 1977. But the Irish were not that interested in hearing about what you now call Black Lives Matter. They were more interested in what's happening in the home country with all the divisions there. And I tried to bring it home to them that they had divisions in their own streets and that the two were connected. And that was a very tough discussion. But I couldn't bear sitting watching the troubles from afar. And as soon as I got qualified, I decided to make the journey back home. And in Ann Arbor, I got involved in anti-apartheid. I got involved in the anti-Shah movement, as it was then, just watching my fellow students engaged in those. And I learned a lot of lessons from the anti-apartheid movement that I was able to bring back. And never in my wildest dreams did I one day believe that I would be sitting with President Mandela in South Africa during our peace talks, listening to him directly talk about apartheid and telling us from Northern Ireland that having to come to this military camp outside on the southern tip of South Africa, where we had been brought secretly, that he would have to, and the organizers would have to have 2 canteens, 2 airplanes, 2 buses, 2 of everything, because the parties wouldn't sit together. The unionists wouldn't sit with Sinn Féin because the ceasefire hadn't been reinstated. And so from anti-apartheid in the 70s to fast forward 1997 and those 3 days in South Africa, as they were transitioning out of apartheid, we sat there and listened. And they were 3 life-changing days in that we brought all those lessons, at least I did, and I know other parties, and Martin McGuinness told me he did. Sinn Féin's representatives came back and said, we need to move this on. And indeed, the ceasefire was reinstated the following week. And the parties began to realize that we needed to do something. If South Africa could do it at the scale at which they had done it, then we needed to do something as well. And so there were all those connections, but certainly the States was a good formative experience for me. And later, the United States mentored our process, as you know, through Bill Clinton first, but with every president staying involved right up to the president, and sending envoys to Northern Ireland who were much needed, and played a role in foreign policy that I think it should be proud of, in a way that they never once had to send a soldier. The United States sent teachers, trainers, mediators, facilitators, diplomats, and that's a lesson, and it worked. So that's a good foreign policy lesson as well.
Sure. We have a couple of questions in as well about Brexit and the possibility of constitutional change. And I wonder if you could say a bit more maybe about how you're seeing that playing out in the work that you do at the moment, and your views on that.
Well, I was enormously disappointed by Brexit in 2016. I couldn't believe that the vote went the way it did. Very small majority at the UK level. In Northern Ireland, the majority was to remain. And being in Europe was hugely important to us, the peace talks. I write in the book about how we used Europe as an example. And John Hume did that. The leader of the SDLP was a great European. And I often spoke about bringing the states of Europe together, as they did after the war, and how we could learn. But I described myself as a European Unionist. And indeed, at one stage in the Northern Ireland Assembly, in that issue of designation, my colleague Jane Morris, who had been the head of the European Commission office in Belfast, wanted to designate as a European Unionist. And as a point of kind of just raising how important the word union doesn't have to be just the union with the United Kingdom or a union with Ireland, that it is connecting us to a bigger world. It's connecting us, our young people, through Erasmus and education programs and exchanges, which brings our head up above the little tiny piece of ground that we're living on. And I wanted to stay connected. So being disconnected through Brexit, and now the fallout from that has been really difficult. But the lesson I learned, Niamh, there is you never know what's coming at you from the left side of the stage. And we could not have predicted that we were leaving it. And it made the border in Ireland irrelevant. That's what a union with Europe did. And then people started talking on the unionist side about the need to reinstate that border. And that wasn't ever going to happen because it wasn't in the agreement. In fact, the opposite was that we would have free movement north and south. And so where were you going to put this border if you were going to have customs? And the next was the sea border. And now we're currently negotiating how to make that a light border. And that's difficult. But, you know, people want to go back and blame one side for Brexit. And yes, Boris Johnson undoubtedly has that to carry, as did Cameron before him. Cameron did not know what he was doing, Prime Minister Cameron, when he said, as part of his manifesto, that he would lead the UK out of Europe. He never, and he told me, and he told many, that he never expected that outcome, hence the reason why he resigned. And now Prime Minister after Prime Minister is trying to deal with this, and some in a ham-fisted way. But it has left Northern Ireland as a very unsettled place again. And that's the politics that we're dealing with, and there's a possibility our executive could collapse in a fortnight's time as a result of it.
Thanks, Monica. I know we're kind of pushed for time here, but maybe one or two more if you're okay. We have a question here on cooperation between women's groups north and south, and what your experience of that was, and how that is now as well.
It was better, believe it or not, in those days. When I first set up the women's studies classes, to bring the women leaders in from the communities, to give them an accreditation so that they could go back out and get the jobs they needed to get in the communities. And we started, those programs took off, and they took off across Northern Ireland. And then I connected them with Alvie Smith, who was opening up her centre at University College Dublin. And the women started travelling north and south, and they were scared witless. The women from the south didn't want to come north because their brogues would be recognised and they might be attacked, which of course wasn't happening. But it was a huge effort of reassurance. The Unionist loyalist women in the north saw the south as a foreign territory. And when they went home and told their partners or their family that they were being bussed down to Dublin for a class. You know, they were told, don't you even think about going there. That was the state we were in back then, and then talking the early 90s. I wish we had kept it up. We were doing it on a shoestring and there wasn't much resources. But we have got a network of women working north and south. And in the Women's Political Association, we learned from what was happening in the south across party lines and across the lines, the way women were working to do that when we set up the coalition. But it's really, really important that Northerners and Southern Ireland come together more closely. And that's what the young people are doing in this Politics in Action in Schools project. But it needs resourced and it needs to be taken seriously. And to be honest, I was talking about this the other night with Avla, who set up the coalition with me. And we were saying, you know, in those days, we didn't have much money, and yet we had more communication. And there's a lesson that needs to open up. And it needs to get a move on, because if we're looking at a referendum coming down the line and people being asked to vote, and we don't even know what way that will go or how, the preparation of that needs to be done now. And there's even concern that the Republic of Ireland might be concerned about who these Northerners are because they're strangers and we don't know them. It's a different culture. You know, the more that it seems to me, the only way that this is happening is through sport, through rugby and maybe even horse equestrian stuff. But that's a very elitist kind of way of doing it. Gaelic football less so, soccer less so, and predominantly male as well, these sports. Less so now because more women are joining it, but there has to be other ways other than sport. It has to be through culture. It has to be through exchanges and music and arts, but also with the women's groups in terms of showing what works in local communities. How do you tackle criminality in your city in Limerick? How do we learn from that up in Belfast? So I know more about how it was tackled in Chicago when I went to live there and teach at the university about 5 or 6 years ago than I did about how it was happening in the South. So that gives you an example of when we go to look for good practice elsewhere, it tends to be in the States or in Europe or UK rather than in the South, and vice versa. So there's everything to play for there. And I'm hoping that the governments will take that forward. The need to have people mixed up, just get a big spoon and start shifting people in those directions. And they may be uncomfortable at the start because they don't know each other. You know, and even though we all grew up in the same island, it's as if we were on a different planet. And that should not remain, because that is a danger for the future if people are being asked to vote on what part of a new country they want to live in.
Thanks so much for that, Monica. I think unfortunately that's all we have time for from the questions, so I'll pass back to Laurie and Robbie now.
Monica, I'd just like to say thank you and to Robbie and to all of the Consulate team in Austin for a wonderful day today and for sharing what you're doing now and what you've done throughout your life. You truly are an inspirational leader, and I'm very grateful to have come to know you, and I hope we can get together again soon.
Thank you, Laurie. And so it passes to me to close the event. Thank you to our audience for your questions. I think it's been a very insightful discussion and exchange both between Laurie and Monica, and then through the questions that people have put to Monica. And I hope, like me, you've learned a lot from it. Just before I conclude, a couple of points of thanks to a number of people today. First and foremost, to Professor Monica McWilliams for speaking to us today. If you haven't already read Monica's autobiography, Stand Up and Speak Out, that she's referenced, and I know it's due to come out soon in the US, I would highly encourage you to do so. It's a really engaging read, offering, as we've heard from Monica today, a perspective on the peace process and indeed the experience of women living in Northern Ireland. that's not been told as much as it should have been. My thanks also to Laurie Gallagher and to the staff of the William J. Flynn Centre for Irish Studies at the University of St. Thomas in Houston for partnering with the Consulate on this event. And finally, to my own team, to Niamh, to Cecilia, to Laura, and also my predecessor, Claire McCarthy, who brought this event together. If you're interested to learn more about how we've been marking St. Bridget's Day in other parts of the US and across the world, and the other inspiring stories that have been showcased, you will find material across the To Be Irish social media accounts on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube. So once again, thank you very much, everyone, and wish you a good day. And
thanks to both of you and to the audience for putting up with my long answers. And Gorora my Haggard, and happy St. Bridget's Day to all of you.
Indeed. Happy St. Bridget's Day.